Okay guys, I'm going to show you how to make suho meso, all the different stages of making it all in one video so everybody can kind of understand the basics of making any type of suho meso, whether it's pork or beef or whatever. So first and foremost, get yourself good high quality meat that is fresh, and most importantly you need to weigh the meat. That is the first thing that you need to do. Is once you've trimmed it and cleaned it, these are ribs, so there's really not too much to do to these. And this is a big old slab of bacon right here. First thing you need to do once they've all been cleaned is take the weight of the meat after it's been trimmed and processed. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take that weight and multiply it by 2%, 2.5%, or 3%. Again, because these are ribs, and they're really thin, there's 3 to a pack. I'm going to go with 2% salt on all of my ribs and 2% salt on my bacon as well, because it's pretty thin. If you're using a bigger cut of meat, like a loin or a shoulder, pechenitsa or whatever, then you're going to need to add a little bit more salt. So if you're a little nervous, I would start off with 2.5% and see how it goes. Then next year, if it was too salty, kick it down to 2%, or if it wasn't salty enough, go to 3%. The thicker the cut of meat, the more salt you're going to need. So if you're doing a prosciutto, you're going to need about 5% salt. And there's a whole nother way of salting a prosciutto that we're not going to get into today. Basically today we're just doing ribs and slanina. Okay, so what else do you need? We know we need salt. I always like to use sea salt. I put a little bit of paprika on the meat to give it a little bit of nice color, a little bit of black pepper, and especially with slanina, I put a bunch of garlic on there as well. So once you've salted your meat and you've added all your other spices, you then move it into a plastic bin like this. And what you do is you put the meat in there with, let's say, the skin side, if you're doing the slanina, the skin side up and the meat side down. And as that salt works through the meat, it's going to drain the water out of the meat. Remember, we're trying to dry the meat, so you're getting all that water out. Every day, you're going to take the meat out, you're going to take your bin, and you're going to dump out the salty water, and then you're going to flip your meat, okay? So the meat goes in Monday like this, Tuesday like that, Wednesday like this, Thursday like that, Friday like this, Saturday like that, okay? What you're doing at that point is you're getting that that salt to penetrate the meat. And again, because these are thin cuts of meat, ribs and slanina, should take 5 to 6 days to get to the center of the meat. And with another cut like a loin or a shoulder, it could take 10 to 12 to 15 days. Just depends on the meat. So that's what we basically call the equalization period. So after about 5 days, I pull the meat out of the plastic bins, and then I come over, I build a little rack. This is a very shoddy and temporary one, but you could see it's just a rack, and I put the meat on the rack and I let it air dry. So after the garlic and the spices and everything's gone onto the meat, I put it up here, and now I'm just letting it air dry. And after about 10 days, 5 days of air drying, 5 days of salt, then I start taking the meat and I put it into the smokehouse, okay? Now, the smokehouse, which, excuse the mess here, guys. The smokehouse, obviously, we're going to smoke outside. The smokehouse is just a little tiny one that I made a while back. Smokehouse has a little source of fire, and basically I light the fire in the Smoky Joe. The smoke pumps in through into the house, and up at the top I've got a vent, so as that smoke comes up and in, it's going to come out of the top of that vent. And what I like to do is smoke the meat anywhere between 3 to 4 times, depending on the cut and depending on how thick it is. But usually I'll put it in the smokehouse 3 times. If it's something a little bit bigger or that I want a little smokier, like my ribs, so when I cook with them I get more smoke flavor, I'll put the meat into the smokehouse maybe 4 times. And each smoke lasts about 6 hours. Now, here in Chicago, it's cold. You could obviously see we got some snow on the ground. I have a little cord down here hanging out, and inside the smokehouse I put a little heater. When it gets really, really cold, I turn that heater on about halfway through the smoke. And the reason I do that is so we don't hit dew point. If we hit dew point, you're going to get condensation all over the meat. So you can see there, I got a little heater. I got a little pan, so the smoke hits the pan first and then dissipates to the sides. And then in here, I've got about a dozen pork loins hanging that have been smoked once, and now they're going through the smokehouse a second time. So you can see the lower part of the smokehouse, the wood isn't even that dark or that stained. The higher you go, the more staining from the smoke you get. You can see the color difference in the door and the gable end of the smokehouse. I mean, it's pretty seasoned in there, and it smells really nice. And then, well, I'm not going to get too far in there, but basically that smoke is going to go through the top and come out through the top of the smokehouse right there. It takes about 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours to get the full fireplace completed, and then it goes back into the garage and hangs until you have lost 40% of the original weight. Okay, so remember the weight of the meat that you took originally, that 13 pounds of ribs. If you multiply it times 60%, 0.6, that should be the dry weight of the meat. Maybe not on the ribs because they're really thin and they're more bone than anything else. But for things like pork loins or slanina or whatever, you're going to multiply 60% of that weight, so it will be about 6 pounds when it's dry. And that means that enough water has dried out of that original slab of meat that you can now consider it cured and edible. Okay, so pork loins, 60%. Some people will say 65%, 35% of the original weight has to be dried off. I personally like 60%, 40% of the water originally to be dried off. To me, it just makes a nicer, firmer, better product. You can see these beef chucks have been out for about 2.5 weeks, and they're still pretty darn soft to the touch. So, and that's good. You want it to go nice and slow, which brings me to my last point. You have to know your humidity and your temperature, 2 of the most important factors when you're drying meat. Okay, you want the humidity to be approximately 60 to 80%. So when you first put the meat to dry, you want that humidity around 80%. And the temperature to be under or around 38 degrees. Now, again, we're pretty lucky here in Chicago. The weather is pretty cooperative in terms of keeping meat in the garage. We've got decent humidity and we've got decent temperatures. You can see just moving it around a little bit from my hand, that fluctuation in the humidity. It's now up to 64. But you want to start off around 80, and then every week drop that humidity nice and slow. So 80 first week, 70 the next week, 60 the following week, 50, 40. And the reason is, if you do it nice and slow, you're not going to get a skin on the outside of your meat. If you've ever noticed when you cut a loin or a piece of beef in half and the red, or it's raw in the middle and too dry on the outside, so what happens is you put a piece of meat in a low humidity area, and you're going to form a skin on the outside of the meat, which prevents the moisture from the center of the meat from coming out. So as long as you're starting with a higher humidity and dropping it nice and slow over a longer period of time, you should be okay. It's not as critical with whole pieces of meat like this, the pork loins and the beef chucks, but it's absolutely critical with any type of sausage that you're making. Sausage will form a really hard, really dry outer layer, and it's pretty much SOL. You could throw it away because the center of it's going to be raw and the outside is going to be hard as a rock. It's just not going to taste good at all. So that's it this year, 2018. We did about 120, 140 pounds of meat. I had a friend ask me to do one more bacon and a couple ribs for him, so I'm going to do that. And see how it turns out. When it's all done, I'll post some photos on YouTube and show you guys how it looks. Hopefully it's going to be good. I went with a 2% salt solution this year, which is a little bit lower than I like. I usually like to be around 2.5%, but some people were complaining that the meat was too salty, so what are you going to do? A little extra salt just helps you drink a little extra wine. So, okay, thanks a lot, guys.